Hello, it's very good to be here again in our third webinar in the series of Securing the Future, all about authorizations and access controls for the AI area. And now, today, we are going to focus on MCP. So let's see what we are going to cover today. But just before that, I'll introduce ourselves. So I'm Gal, I'm a co-founder and CPO at PlainID, and with me I have Vladi.
Hello,
Vladi,
everyone.
yeah,
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Vladi Berger, VP Solution Engineering at PlainID. Good to be here.
and not just good to be here, we are going to speak about an interesting subject.
That's right.
So, why is it so interesting? It's interesting because MCP is becoming rapidly adopted by many organizations. It's all over the place. Everyone is speaking about MCP, but even though it's very good to have MCP in place, it makes things much, much simpler. It's still a critical protocol that introduces significant security implications. So today, what we plan to do is understand what is MCP, what are the security implications, what's already available, and what you should consider when you start using MCP in regards to access controls and authorization. So that's our plan for today. And we are also planning a live demo. Vladi would walk us through a live demo of securing an agent which utilizes MCP. We are going to show you some of the policy, even change the policy and see how that would impact the activity with the MCP server. And obviously we'll end with some key takeaways. So let's get started. First of all, what is MCP? I guess if you're here with us, you probably are very much already familiar, but just to get things straight, MCP, the Module Context Protocol, is an open standard by Anthropic that enables AI modules to securely connect with external tools. Now, securely connect is an overstatement, and we'll touch about that, but I would say helps AI modules to easily connect with external tools, data sources, and services. You probably heard the USB-C for services and tools, and that's what MCP is. It makes life much, much, much more easier for AI agents and for AI modules, and making things easier for a software program eventually means that there are many more risks to consider. So in a very high level, we can say that an AI agent would use an MCP client component, and Vladi would touch more on that later. The MCP client would connect to the MCP server, and that MCP server would expose and then utilize a set of tools, APIs, and data sources. So that is in high level the concept we are talking about. Another thing we want to point out are the list of tools an MCP server exposes. An MCP server is not just access to one big thing, right? It can expose a set of tools. And here is a very simple example. If I can think about an MCP server that is all about account management, then I can expect to have a set of tools, one that would get account details, another tool that can get an account balance, and maybe a third one that can get the statement of the account. So basically what we are saying, the implementation of an MCP server, first of all, exposes or makes access available for a set of tools. That's the first step to understand. Obviously, those tools also enable access to data, which is a second challenge that needs to be addressed. But that's what we are going to start with. Now, understanding the connection details and the flow, I'll hand it over to Vladi.
Yep. Hello again. So we're going to talk about how MCP server actually works and what is the flow. So as you can see, there is a user question. User is trying to interact with the AI agent, and then agent wants to connect to the MCP server. And there is a client libraries like MCP client for Python, for Node, whatever, right? And the first thing is when connection is established, MCP client asks, okay, give me a list of your capabilities. Give me a list of tools, give me a list of prompts, resources, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then MCP server sends back the list of tools, and the user actually, the client actually now knows, okay, this is the list of tools that this MCP server exposed, and then introduce them into the AI agent. Okay. In this case, agent can use those tools based on agent decisions. So the agent actually make the decision which tool to use and at which step. Okay. And of course, it asks the tool to to use the tool, and then the client sends the request into the tool and executes the actual action behind the scenes and send response back to the AI agent, and then based on the response from the tool, AI agent behaves. How behaves? We will see later on. Okay, back to you, Gal.
Okay, thank you. So this flow is important because later on we are going to go back to this flow and see where we should consider placing those controls we want to focus on. Okay, so remember that slide. We'll also introduce that later as well. So this is MCP, high levels of how MCP works. Now, what are some common implementations of MCP servers that are available out there? There are, by the way, so many MCP servers, hundreds, if not thousands of MCP servers. But, just to give some idea of how that looks like, Vladi,
Yeah.
can you take us
So
through examples?
yes, of course. So as you know, many of MCP servers are already published by the vendors, by Anthropic itself, and a lot of open source, even by developers, are randomly introduced MCP servers. As an example, in this slide, you can see the file system, okay, where you can operate or manipulate your files, move files from one location to another, maybe delete files, maybe create a new files and stuff like that. Okay, Git MCP, it's very familiar for the developers, so it works. You can work with your repositories. It's kind of official GitHub MCP server, if I remember correctly, right? Where you can manage your code, and Postgres is an example. So actually, you can manipulate your tables, your data inside those tables and stuff like that, which is very kind of open to many risks, by the way, and we will touch it maybe later on. Okay, and of course there are a lot more MCP servers. So today, everyone trying to actually introduce its own MCP server, just to say, okay, I have it. Back to you guys.
Yeah, so we obviously brought some samples of MCP servers that are more data focused because we want to emphasize the security risk. It's not even a challenge, but the security risk that is there with exposure of data and misuse of MCP servers, over permitted agents, and so on. So obviously, when we start seeing those MCP servers with access to data, whether it's Postgres or structured data or file system, it means now we are giving the agent a simple way to access all that data. And without sufficient controls in place, then it leads straight to exposure of data and those security risks we've been speaking of. Now, it's not just in theory, right? It's not just in theory. If you would run a search today around what are some of the common MCP incidents that are already there. MCP, by the way, is not that old, right? It's like here for a year or so. And already there are CVEs for MCP servers. So let's look at some of those examples. I think one of the most common one is the Asana MCP server cross-tenant data exposure. That happened not so long ago, where Asana introduced an MCP server, but they failed to filter according to the tenant of the owner, the data according to the tenant owner, and that led to exposure of data from one customer to another, just because the right controls were not introduced properly. The result was they had to immediately, of course, take off that MCP server. They notified all the customers, all the organizations that were impacted, approximately 1,000 customers, and eventually they released a fix to that, and they asked their customers to update accordingly. But that just shows one type of risk associated with those MCP servers. MCP presents an interface which is very easy to use by AI agents. It is very appealing to create MCPs, to expose your services easily, and also it's very appealing to use MCPs because it's easy to do so. But we need to do that with security in mind, and specifically access controls and authorization. Another very known example, a bit older, Vladi would share with us.
Yeah. So Slack MCP vulnerability, I would say, right? So actually what happened, as you can see, actually Anthropic introduced an MCP server for Slack. It's this specific MCP server developed by Anthropic itself. It is very important to mention it. Okay, and it exposed there was a vulnerability which actually showed the leak of sensitive data, and how it was done. So actually, by the way, it's related not only to Slack. Most of the messenger applications are trying to unfurl the URLs which are sending to them. For example, you can actually dynamically, based on prompt, generate a URL which is malicious URL, and Slack actually will try to access this URL. It doesn't matter what, I mean, it is very important what code is behind this URL. So you can send many stuff. You can send the API keys, which are taken from your laptop, or if you're running local MCP server, stuff like that. So it is very important to understand that in this case, MCP generates URL and Slack is trying to execute and go into this URL. What happened next, you can imagine. Okay, so what was the result? There is a CVE, and Anthropic just decides, okay, we are not going to use it we will going to archive it, actually, okay? And then that's basically it.
Yeah, so Anthropic decided to deprecate the server, the MCP server for Slack they released. There's a CVE. And again, it just shows the risks associated with running too fast without sufficient controls in place for MCP implementation. Now, the last example we want to share with you is actually not a singular example, but it is a report by Backslash Security. They have identified 7,000 MCP servers that are available on the web, and hundreds of them are open to unauthorized connections, and even more, 70 have severe vulnerabilities that enable data leakage. So MCP servers are there, and people are rushing into building MCP servers without sufficient controls in place, and that can lead to high risk, and specifically the data exposure, unauthorized access, and overall system disruption. And that's why we are having this webinar, just to put in mind the security controls for access and authorization that are required when using MCPs. Okay? So let's get started. And in order to get started with the solution, we talked up until now about the challenge. So there's a big security risk, attack surface is growing, MCP is excellent, but do that with the right controls in mind. Let's start by understanding what is natively introduced by the protocol. Okay, so Vlad, can you take us through that?
Yes, of course. So let's talk about it. So actually, we are talking about MCP access control, authentication, authorization, and token management. So it's all about OAuth2, right? So if you are looking at the standard, MCP standard, I mean, okay, they are saying, okay, just you have to implement OAuth2 protocol, OAuth2 standard. Okay, on the right side, you can see the flow. Actually, it's like a client goes to authorization server, gets the token and stuff, and then uses the token. I'm not going to actually go over each and every step in the OAuth2 flow, but what is important, the user presents itself, and authorization server, which can be any authorization server, of course, it can be Okta, Ping, whatever, you name it, okay? And then it generates the barrier token, which is used by MCP client to authenticate into the MCP server, okay? What this standard is not saying, okay, what are the controls inside the MCP server itself, right? What tool I can use, what prompt I can use. There is nothing in the standard itself. There are many techniques you can introduce, even using your OAuth2 flow, like claims or scopes or whatever. You can imagine there is no standard. It's very important. And therefore, everyone can do whatever you want, right? So this is about the access control. Some of the security requirements, it's very important. Okay, so it's very important to explicitly bind the token to the server. Audience validation on the MCP server side. Okay, also important. And no token pass-through. Okay, also important to not use the original token in order to go forward and use it for other stuff. Okay, those are the most important controls that are introduced by MCP standard itself. But what we are trying is to actually get it a bit forward and introduce some new features which are more fine, more granular, I would say, features. Okay, and again, we will see it in our demo. And back to you, Gab.
Okay, so MCP, the protocol itself, does introduce some authentication, authorization capabilities. But first of all, obviously, like you said, it is the responsibility of the developer to actually implement them. But still, even with what they introduce, we know it's not sufficient. Now, there are multiple security risks associated with the usage of MCP. And we are not going to cover all of them, but we do want to focus on one of them, which is more relevant to our space. And that's excessive permission, right? Vlad, a few words on that?
Yep. So as we spoke before, it's up to developer how to deal within the MCP, how to deal with the request within the MCP server itself. And let's have like very a small example, database. So actually what's going to happen, you're going to introduce some application account, which will be used by MCP server to access to the database itself. So meaning there is no kind of, everything is possible within this account. Maybe it will be limited to one table, maybe it will be limited to one schema, doesn't matter. But doesn't matter who is the user behind the scenes. The agent, the MCP server has access based on this particular system account. Okay, just to talk about a bit more about other vulnerabilities in the MCP server itself is, for example, OS command execution capabilities without proper sandboxing. So each and every OS command should be executed in very specific sandbox. Again, it's up to developer, but it's a risk. Okay. Now, sandbox escape vulnerability, it's almost the same. Tool description injection. Sometimes you are interacting with MCP, which are built by third party, and you don't always know how the description looks like. And there are many vulnerabilities you can actually see based on the tool description injection. I'm not going in this session at least to talk about it, to show it, but there are vulnerabilities. And of course, as we spoke, authentication protocol weakness, sometimes it is vulnerable and configuration drift, of course. Okay. The most important one, and that's what PlainID is trying to solve, is the excessive permissions. Okay. This is our job. This is our product. This is our platform.
Excellent, thank you. And while saying that, we also want to remind about the identity issue, right? It's always true, and it's true here as well. We need to remember the identities which are involved in the process, right? It's not just the agent user. Yes, it's the agent user who's working and acting and accessing the MCP server. But the agent user, in many cases, is operating on behalf of an end user. So there are multiple answers how to handle that. But the bottom line is we need to always to consider both of the users, the agent user and the end user. We saw before that passing through the token without validation, that's really a bad practice. So we don't want to do that. But we do want to take into account both the end user identity and the agent user identity. Obviously, the agent user would have much larger permission set and ability to access more tools, more data than just the end user. However, we do not want the agent user to exploit that wide access with end users that should not have access to those tools. So remember, we have both the human and non-human identities in the mix, and both should be considered. Vlad, anything to add on that?
So yeah, it is very important to actually to have a context. Okay, it's very important, at least from my point of view, to introduce the context, who is the user, sometimes where this user operates, like maybe the location of the user, maybe the behavior of the user, risk. Okay, risk is very important. So if the user is risky for now, there are a lot of risk-based authentication systems that can help us actually understand, okay, is this user is safe now to do this stuff? Is it okay to allow this user to, for example, run this particular tool, which is very sensitive tool sometimes, right? So yeah, that's very important to know the user context and the other stuff like environmental data.
Yeah, exactly. That's where the dynamic policies come in, right? And that's what we want. That's what we want to talk about now. So, bottom line, what we are saying is to address all those challenges, reduce the risk, even with all, not even, also with MCP, is to utilize your best practices from zero trust. And policy-based access control, that's the way to implement zero trust also for MCP security. That means that you can build your AI systems with identity-first security in mind. Every interaction with the MCP server is verified and checked against the end user identity, not just the agent identity. At this point of time, at this type of context, is the action authorized or not authorized? Can the user use those tools, access this data? Those are all important questions to answer during the process. The second part of that is minimize risk with dynamic and context-aware enforcement. We can't rely just on static rules. It's not enough. It's not enough to address the risks that are associated with this attack surface. It's not enough to associate the risk which MCP introduces today into the AI flow. MCP is here probably to stay. We don't know, right? But it seems like it is very widely adopted. And since everyone is using MCP, vendor companies are building MCP servers, even organizations are building internal MCPs, which gives very wide access to a set of tools and data. It means the controls must be more restrictive than ever. They must be more tight, and they need to address or to follow the zero trust guidelines. And the way to do that is by enforcing dynamic, context-aware controls. Now, it all fits into a flow. MCP is not there as a standalone process. MCP is part of the overall AI flow. Remember, AI also, any AI agent, AI system, whatever, they also have the data which feeds into the process. They have the response. So there is a process. It's not a singular implementation of an MCP server. And therefore, it's not enough just to enforce at one point. We also need to understand the overall context. That's why centralized control is important, to understand the overall context. What tools can be accessed should be aligned with the data that is feeding the process, the questions the identities can ask, and eventually the data which is sent as part of the response. So yes, controls are at multiple points, but the management should be done centralized. And the last part we should never forget, especially in security, is auditing and observability. Because after everything has happened, we always need to be able to go back and understand what happened. We need those evidence that policies were in place and this events have happened. The user has tried to access a set of data or a set of tools, the policy permitted or did not permit. We need to understand the full flow of events, and for that, audit and overall observability of the process is required. And again, it is tied back to why policy-based is the right method to enforce also the MCP security. And to get some more specific data on that, we are going to go back to this flow we introduced at the beginning of the webinar. And now let Vlad walk us through where controls are actually needed or at least be considered in this flow.
Sure, Gal. All right. I believe you remember we started with this particular slide at first, just to explain what is the flow and how everything is done. So how we can secure it actually. Let's start from the first point. Now let's go back. Send a list of tools, right? So actually we can control based on the user policies. We can prevent of some tools to be even exposed to this particular user. So meaning the client won't even see those tools. So this is the first control we can introduce, right? The next step is execute action. Actually, in order to run the tool, you don't have to see the list in advance. You can directly actually go and execute the tool, execute the action. Okay, so this is the another control we can actually put into our system, right? And the last but not least is the response with the results. Okay, are all the results from the MCP server should be visible to the user? Depends on the policy, right? So we can create even policy which are filtering the result. Okay, and presents to the user only the relevant for this particular user, only allowed data. I'm talking about not to the user, to the AI assistant actually, to the AI agent, because based on those responses, AI agent generates the final answer to the user. Okay, so 3 points we can control, and based on that, we can improve our MCP tool access. Okay, and it's very aligned with the zero trust approach, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So why don't we see some of that in action? It's time for the demo. So
Of
let's
course.
hand it over to Vladi for the
Of
demo.
course. So now I'm going to share my screen and do a live demo, as God said, and let's do it. So let's share. Okay, cool. I'll start with the actually the MCP inspector. This is an open source tool built by some community, which can show exactly what MCP server does, what tools are available, what prompts are available, and so on and so forth. We are going to focus on the tools itself. So the first of all, I'm going to connect to my MCP servers, just a very simple MCP server, which has like 5, 6, whatever tools. I think I'm connected to it, okay? And I can do like go to the tools and run list tools. As you can see, my MCP server have those tools like add, multiply. It's kind of very simple, and you can find this open source a lot of places. Okay, and I've added 2 more tools, which is get account balance and get account details, and I'm going to show how it works. So now this one is the original MCP server. Okay, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to introduce MCP gateway. So basically, PlainID developed our own MCP gateway, which can control access to MCP servers and tools that are introduced by those MCP servers. Okay. Of course, I'm going to send the buyer token. I'm just very quick how the token looks like. This is the token I'm using on my demo. And the one thing is very important to see is the role of the user. Again, for simplicity, I put the role into the token. Okay, so now I'm going to change my configuration to use our MCP gateway, just different port. Okay, so I'm going to use the same user token, but in this case, I'm going to connect to it. It goes through the MCP gateway, and let's clear all the tools, and then list tools again. As you can see, there is only one tool allowed to this particular user based on user role. Okay, and let's go in very quick look at the policies. So actually, this is our PlainID platform, um, and this part actually, the tool access says, okay, for those users which are tellers, the tools that are allowed get account details. Okay, and even more, let's go and try to use it in our demo kind of application. Okay, it's a just demo application. We're going to use it in order to see how it works in real world. Okay, so basically I'm telling my user is teller, and now I'm going to run some prompt, show me account details for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just account ID. Okay, so actually it's going to run our flow, and as you can see, there is an answer from it uses actually MCP tool in order to get this information. Okay, the next step, and now show me the balance. Show me the balance. If you remember, currently the get balance is not available for this user. Therefore, it says, okay, I don't have the right tool. So there is no get balance tool because this tool is not allowed to the user. But now let's do and change the policy. Let's change the policy and introduce a new tool to the user. For that, let me just what I'm going to do is to add one more tool. Oops, my bad. Give me 1 second, and then we can go and in our tools we can change the role into the one. Sorry, my bad. Policy to our policy. Okay, now we should be good. We can add additional tool, which is get account balance as well. Okay, so now this tool is accessible to the user. And let's go back to our demo and run this question again. Show me the balance. And now magic happened. So actually, from this point of time, the balance is also available to the requester actually, okay? And let's go back to our MCP inspector. So if I'm going to reconnect to the server and then run list of tools, now both of tools are available for this user, okay? So that's basically it from the demo perspective. And
Excellent.
back to you, Gal.
Okay.
And by the way, there's a question mark, and you can always ask a question, and we will at least try to address them. Feel free.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for the demo, Vladi. Before we'll answer some of the questions that we have here, we want to leave you with some key takeaways. The first one, don't wait, act now. MCPs are here, your organization is probably already adopting them, and you need to do that securely from day one. It's not an option, right? Because that would, like avoiding that or delaying that would just lead to exposure and unnecessarily risk. Second, authentication is not sufficient. We can't address MCP security just with authentication. Authorizations are crucial and they need to be dynamic and policy driven in order to provide the relevant level of controls for those MCPs. And the last one is identity first. Remember that AI agents are basically delegating access of the identities they serve, right? And that's why context and the risk of those users matter. That's where policies can support the security needs of this new era. So those are our key takeaways. And with that, we'll open to some questions. So let's see what questions we have. So the first one that we have here is around data. What about data filtering and masking? We focused primarily on tools, so which tools can be used or cannot be used according to the policy. The question is around data. Vlad, did you want to answer that?
Yes, of course, then, of course. So actually, I mentioned that is part of the flow we are trying to introduce. And then, yes, of course, there is a way to reduce the data which is coming back from the MCP server. Okay, there is a way. There are controls we can put on the MCP server itself where we can deal with the request, maybe with the response. It depends. The most common one answer is it depends, but still we can implement some controls on the MCP server itself and we can deal with it. Okay, so yes, it is possible.
Yeah, it's not only possible, it's also important to consider the data itself, because eventually it's not sufficient just to control the tools. Even though it's a very good starting point, the data which is being used and exposed through the process should also be secured accordingly. Second question here is around implementing controls in the MCP server itself. If it's possible, we demonstrated implementing controls in between the MCP client and the MCP server. And the question is about implementing that in the MCP server itself. Vladi?
Yeah. So first of all, yes, it is possible. Sometimes it's needed. For example, just to control the data flow, right? What data is coming? What is the query which is running into our database or our API and stuff like that? So yeah, it should be done at the MCP server level using PlainID policies, of course. So the integration can be done at the MCP server level itself, if it is possible, of course, to change the code, to change the a bit implementation, integration with the third-party APIs or databases and stuff like that. So yes, it is important to use it. And yep.
Yeah, I would just add to that, even obviously it's important, but it's not always possible, right? Because sometimes MCP servers are a third-party service, and we can't make sure that all third parties have actually, implemented the relevant security controls. So it still remains a challenge, and we cannot rely on MCP servers implementing the full set of controls which are required. And the second part to that, don't forget the identity. The server, the MCP server, doesn't always know the identity. That's also a part to consider, especially those general available MCP servers. And that's why, yes, it is important to implement authorizations in the MCP server, but it's not the only thing that needs to be considered. And the last question we have here, what part of that is logged? Yeah, I can take that answer. It's because it's an easy one. Well, the answer is everything. Everything is logged, especially, when you're working with PlainID, we log every interaction of the authorization process, every request, every response, and what has participated in the response, what has affected the response that is sent back. It's extremely important in order to understand what happened, why decisions were made, and what they were based on, which policies participated in the decision. So obviously this is an important part. The majority of our customers are sharing or sending those logs to their SOCs, SIEMs and SOCs and so on, in order to analyze them and correlate with security events that might have happened, or to get that insights in a more detailed way. Those are all the questions we have for today. We want to thank you for participating, and obviously you have the links. The links will be shared with you later on, and you can expect more from us, more from PlainID around securing the future, authorizations and access controls for the AI, for the agentic AI area. So thank you all, and that's it. Thank you, Vladi.
Thank you, Gal, and thank you guys to join us.
Bye.